the graveyard poets? So the graveyard poets were a unique group of poets that came up in the 18th century, who were more of inspired creators than the technical masters that defined their age more prominently. So this was the age of Dryden, Pope, and these were the technical masters who mastered the iambic pentameter, who mastered the classical style. Now these people, the graveyard poets, they belong to the age of transition. They were the sentimental poets. Though they could adopt the classical style in structure, they could not adhere to the sentiments in their poems. Their sentiments were their own, very personal, very subjective, and very much melancholic as well. So in fact, the graveyard poets belong to the age of transition of the 18th century, whose poetry with a defined melancholic undertone set them apart from the likes of Pope and Dryden. Robert Blair, with his poem The Grave, is believed to be the most influential in giving rise to the graveyard school. But Gray, with his elegy written in a country churchyard, has to be the most popular and the most well-read one. The 18th century witnessed a great transition in its style of poetry, moving away from the classical literature of intellectuality to the more sentimental tone and theme of human emotions. This change was not sudden or rapid, but gradual. It followed a natural progression through the classical to the romantic. The poets of sentiment are not parted from classical poets by any clear timeline. In fact, they overlap, as I said. In fact, we have poets like Thomas Gray and Edward Young. Excuse me. So we have poets like Thomas Gray, Edward Young, who follow the classical structure in their poems, but delve more into the emotional or sentimental content than the rational. And we also witness this emotional reflection in Coleridge's Dejection and Ode and Keats's Ode on Melancholy. The early work of Sade, Byron, Shelley, all of them show the influence of the graveyard school. So what was the main thing that defined these poets? It was the melancholic or elegiac tone that was a popular theme in all their poems. The central theme was the celebration of the private individual's idiosyncratic yet paradigmatic response to the visions of the world. So these poets were also known as the churchyard poets. And there were a number of pre-romantic English poets of the 18th century characterized by their gloomy meditations on mortality. The prominent writers of this group, dispersed in timeline but united in theme, were Thomas Parnell, Edward Young, Robert Blair, and Thomas Gray. These poets wrote a type of mournfully reflective poetry with emphasis on brevity of life, gloomy meditations of mortality, hope of immortality, and sometimes focused on a single death and memories of the departed. Because of the elegiac tone of their poems and their reflections on death and grave, these poets got the name of graveyard poets in 1898, when William McNeill Dixon first used this term. The name, so apt, got popular over time. The term churchyard poets also has its reference drawn from the apparent religious leanings exhibited in their poem. For example, Robert Blair in his Grave, The Grave, that's his poem, he talks of grave as being the ultimate leveler and an instrument of the Almighty in the following lines, in these lines. These are just the few opening lines of the poem that I'll be reciting. While some affect the sun and some the shade, some flee the country, some the hermitage, their aims as various as roads they take, in journeying through life, the task be mine, to paint the gloomy horrors of the tomb, the appointed place of rendezvous, where all these travelers meet. So it is a very, very biblical, religious allusion of all the people, all the life being travelers, and how they all meet in the house of God, and all of them have the same grave to go into, and that is where they all are equal. So Blair talks about the different paths that individuals might take up in life, but must end in the same place, that is the grave in death. The religious and moral preoccupations are evident in elegy written in a country churchyard as well. The poem speaks of ordinary people. It is an elegy for poor but honest villagers. They are not famous, but they are equally the sons of God. So the poet has written this poem in honoring them. The poem talks about death as an equalizer. Rich or poor should end in death. Moreover, no man can escape death. In death, all are equal. Besides, nothing, including any amount of rich or glory, can bring the dead to life. Even poor people deserve respect for their death. Given opportunities, they would have become great men in their times. Who knows? Some literary critics have emphasized Milton's minor poetry as being one of the major influences of the graveyard poets. However, there are detractors, as in everything. There are supporters and there are detractors. There are detractors of this theory as well. So some literary critics have emphasized Milton's minor poetry as the main influence of the meditative verse written by graveyard poets, especially W.L. Phelps, for example, said it was not so much in form as in thought that Milton affected the Romantic movement. And although Paradise Lost was always reverentially considered his greatest work, it was not at this time nearly so effective as his minor poetry. And in the latter, it was Il Penseroso, the love of meditative, comfortably melancholic, that penetrated most deeply into the romantic soul. However, other critics like Raymond D. Hibbins, Harko Dimar, and Eric Partridge have challenged the direct influence of Milton's poem, claiming rather that graveyard poetry came from a culmination of literary precedents. As a result of religious revival, the early 18th century was a time of both spiritual unrest and regeneration. Therefore, meditation and melancholy, death and life, ghosts and graveyards were attractive subjects to poets at the time. These subjects were, however, interesting to earlier poets as well. So it need not be only Milton that might have inspired these poets. So these subjects were interesting to earlier poets as well. The graveyard school's melancholy was not new to English literature or English poetry, but rather a continuation of the previous centuries. There is even an elegiac quality to the poems almost reminiscent of Anglo-Saxon literature. The characteristic and style of graveyard poetry is not unique to them, and the same themes and tone are found in ballads and odes. Many of the graveyard school poets, like Thomas Parnell, were Christian clergymen, and as such, they often wrote didactic poetry, combining aesthetic with religion and moral instruction. They were also inclined towards contemplating subjects related to life after death, which is reflected in how their writings focused on human mortality and man's relation to the divine. The religious culture of the mid-18th century included an emphasis on private devotion as well as the end of printed funeral sermons. Each of these conditions demanded a new kind of text with which people could meditate on life and death in personal setting. The graveyard school met that need, and the poems were thus quite popular, especially with the middle class that was still largely Puritan in its mental framework. Edward Young's Night Thoughts is one such popular poem of the time that struck a deep chord with the readers. The complaint, or Night Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality, better known as Night Thoughts, is a long poem in 9 cantos, and it was published between 1742 to 1745 and illustrated the poet's musings on death over a series of 9 parts, in which he ponders the loss of his wife and friends and laments human frailties. Night Thoughts had a very high reputation for many years after its publication, wherein the 9 nights are each a poem of their own. The works of the graveyard school continued to be popular in the 19th century and were instrumental in the development of the Gothic novel, contributing to the dark, mysterious mood and storylines that characterize the genre. Graveyard school writers focused their writing on the lives of ordinary people, the unidentified characters. They also considered pre-romanticists ushering in the romantic literary movements by their